What's the biggest frustration of being a mom? What's the biggest frustration of being a mom? When the kids want really expensive items and maybe I cannot obtain those items at the time that they want them. But there's a difference between a need and a want. A want, if you want it bad enough, maybe the person itself can make it happen, maybe I can make it happen. But if it's not bad enough, it doesn't need to be anyway. And there's been hard times, I admit. I have a lot of friends who help me through it. Friendship is a big thing to me. There's times I'm angry. I get angry. I stay angry. Now, if I need food stamps, I know they're there. Right now, I'm not on them. I may have to be on them next month. That doesn't bother me in the least. A lot of people, this is a quote-unquote pride buster for these people. It's not for me. It's not for me. Because when it comes to my kids eating, there is no pride. If someone wants to help me, either it be financially or making a gift to my children, it doesn't bother me. I am a prideful person in who I am. You can tell that it reeks off of me. But for someone to help me, I hope in the future I can help someone else. The only thing that I have lost through this whole divorce was I had some rings. It came up, I needed to pay the rent. I did not have the money. The kids needed to be fed, so therefore the rings went. Did it hurt my feelings? No, I would put them on the line for that. But sacrifices, as a mom, you sacrifice a lot of time. You try to take extra time for the kids, all the kids. The kids have been good to me. The kids sacrifice their time for me at times. There is no sacrifice in being a mom. You want to sit down and give it all up? Absolutely. But you don't do it. You just don't. It don't pay the bills. It don't feed the kids. It don't get it. Being a mom will drive you harder than anything you've ever done in some aspects. But it all comes down to I'm a Leo. I'm a fighter. I was born a fighter. I've always strived for better from the time I was a child up. I've always wanted better. And that's what keeps me going. Education, there's not enough in the world for me. I could keep my head in a book the rest of my life if I had the time. I don't understand it myself, but I'm too much of a fighter to just sit down and say, okay, I give up. Do I have depression? Sure. They ain't a person in this world that don't. Pride is not an issue here. It can't be, not when you're raising kids. Because if you let your pride stand in the way, you're hurting no one but those kids. I promise you that. I'll probably not work over part-time until my girls are raised, for the simple reason my children need me more than we need the money. You kind of plan. Mostly what I do with my odd jobs and everything is basically half of mine goes in the bank. I am more fortunate than most. My daughter, she draws SSI, and that has put us a step up, and then there's so much in the child support. And as long as this is a constant thing in my life, this is good. There are social programs out there that will help you. But the first thing I will tell a divorced mother is she has to want to help herself. If I see a bill that's coming up that I can't handle, like last Christmas, I felt that I could not handle Christmas. I went to work at Walmart's. I worked there for 6 months. I enjoyed it, you know, until I met myself coming, as the old saying goes. I got to where I was spending more hours down there than I was at home. I won't have that for my children. Basically, everything has went pretty well like clockwork up to this point. You keep your bills down to a limit. You are not so apt to jump in debt. Let me explain myself. I have been on both ends of the economic status to me in my lifetime. I started out, we had nothing. We were 4 kids, we were raised by 2 parents. My parents were dirt poor. I was not born with a silver spoon down my throat and never was. So where I was at in my marriage was economically sound. We was in good shape financially. Okay, all this got destroyed. Now it's my turn to build it. And I get to build it my way. And you're not so apt to jump in that debt. Like some people will see that new car. They don't worry about whether they can make those payments tomorrow. I won't be so apt to trade that car until I know that I'm economically sound enough to do it. If that car has a running ability and it can be repaired, it's going to be repaired. Now, the biggest expense I've had since I've been up here, I had to come up with 2 new tires for that puppy. Now, that don't sound like a whole lot, and $64 don't, but do you realize what I can do with $64? I could probably feed those kids 2 weeks on $64 easy. You find corners to cut, you know where to shop, you know what sales to shop and what not to shop. You know to stay out of the expensive stores, which I'm not an expensive store person myself, but you keep to the basics and you're not so apt to get into such a mess that you cannot get out of. Keep it to the basics. Because I come from a divorced family. I know what that's like. Especially at my baby's age, she's the same age I was. So yeah, I do. That hurts bad. We talk our way through it. Sometimes it magically appears. There's been a few occasions it's magically appeared. She knows if she hangs in there, it'll work out. She knows this. My kids mean more to me than my own life. You mess, excuse me, with me, that's fine. You can trump on me 5 days a week. You mess with one of my kids, you've got a problem. I have been told I'm a good mom. I won't sit here and say I'm the world's greatest mom. That is for my kids to judge. My kids, when they get grown, they will look back on these experiences and they will judge it as, well, you did right by me, or you did the best you could by me, or you didn't give me time of day. Yeah, I feel like I'm a good mother in the sense that I've seen bad moms. I don't like those moms, not very well at all. My kids come first. Like I said, I'd walk you over and see your dad before you bother my kids. I don't date a lot because of my kids. I've got 2 young teenage daughters. Nowadays, that's saying something big. I quit school when I was 15. I didn't get my GED until 1990, but I found out real fast that can open doors like you will not believe. I stress education because education is going to open doors for better paying jobs, where mommy don't have to work 60 hours just to make sure that the light bill, the rent, and the kids are fed. Because if mom takes a minimum wage job, mom can end up being away from the child more than she would ever intended to, just to see that the basics are there. We come up with a preconceived notion, well, we get married, our husband will take care of us. So therefore, if we go out and we get a job while we're married, this is extra spending money for the family. We could get those little extras that maybe sis or Bubby didn't have, or Bubby can finally play the football he wanted, or sis could always be the cheerleader she wanted. And like I said, it's something that got carried completely out of hand, because when we started having our children, we wanted better, but we were willing to hand it over on a silver platter. We was never willing to make them work for it. And that, my friend, is no good. They need to work for it. Therefore, they'll know and appreciate it more for what it is. The divorced mommy, I would advise you not to jump in and get married again just because you quote unquote cannot meet your bills month for month. This is not a reason to get married. This is not. It would never work. 9 times out of 10, when you get into multiple marriages, your chances are getting slimmer like by the day. Take your time. Enjoy yourself. Enjoy your freedom. It'll work out. It always does. As for the mothers who's working with the disabled fathers, I'll pray for you. Hopefully your husbands will be able to work out help out at home while you are working, and they can be there for the kids. I believe in one parent should be there for the kids at least 3/4 of the time. It's going to be tough. It really is. And like I say, I think the key to this whole thing is a better education. Find your strongest suit and play on it to the hilt. But always check your options. Call the technical schools, call the colleges, call each and every one, see what they have to offer. Every one of them will think that they offer you the best deal that is going, but shop around. Be very careful. Check your references.
I'm Sheila Smith, I'm a physical therapy technician for Our Lady of the, Our Lady of the Way Hospital. It'd been several, I'd not worked since before my baby was born in '84. It's been several years because he worked and I didn't have to. There was a major change.
What was that?
Well, I was used to being home with my baby all the time and doing all the housework, and then it changed around. I'm doing the working out, and my husband does the housework now. And gosh, there's just all kinds of changes. But it makes me feel better about myself. When you go out and you're bringing the income in, it makes you do feel better about yourself. I enjoy it. I really do, because my husband can't work now, so I'm bringing the income in for the family, supporting my family, so I really feel better about it. It gets tiresome. I get real tired sometimes, but I still, after I work all day, I go home and I cook supper, and me and my husband wash dishes together, and then we have time with my son. You do get tired doing it, but it's worth it in the long run because it's to help your family, so it's worth it. Because if you love your family, you'll do whatever you can to help your family. But yeah, it's worth it. It really is. When you go home and see their faces, makes it all worth it. Tired. Sometimes you don't think you can make it onto the couch, but you go on anyway. Well, at first I was nervous. The thoughts of going back to work made me real nervous because it had been several years, like 10 years since I had been in the job force. I was real nervous, having to start all over again, getting to know all different people, back in the swing of things. It made me real nervous. It's been hard on him because he was always used to me being home with him, helping him with when he went to start school, I always helped him with his homework, and now his dad's got to help him with that, and we always got out and played games with him, ball games, different stuff of the evenings, and now his dad can't do that, so it's been really rough on my son like that. It gets hard, when I come home some days, he's just so happy to see me and things. Like I said, that makes it all worth it, knowing that you're doing for him, making him feel good. I usually get up at 6 o'clock in the mornings, usually get ready for work, get my son up when school's going on, and get my son up at like 6:30. Then when he goes off to school, I finish getting ready to go to work, and then I usually get to work at 8, and we work through the days, like I said, according to how many patients we have. So I usually try and I fix breakfast, whatever my son wants for breakfast in the mornings before he goes to school. And then I go on to work.
And then what about when you get home?
Now I come home, like I said, I usually get home 4:35, 5:30. It's always different hours when I get home. I go home and I cook supper, and then like I said, we wash dishes, then I get my son, help him with his homework, whatever he has to do, and then we usually sit and watch some TV together, and then get him ready for bed, and then I get ready for bed. So it's usually like 12 o'clock at night before I get to bed. So I started working like in June of '93. My husband, he got hurt, he fell and broke his leg in November of '92, and he drawed workman's compensation until February of '93, and I went to work in June of '93, and I knew like from February until then that I would really have to go back to work. And it made me, there was some different feelings going on inside, knowing that I had to leave my son, that I couldn't be there. Like when he came home from school of the evenings, his dad was going to be there, because you've got all those worries. You've got to worry about bringing all the money in to pay all the bills, and all the doctor bills, and I know I'm using my hands and I shouldn't be. But I don't know how it really made me feel, I didn't want to go out to work, but I knew my husband had worked as long as he could. He couldn't go to work anymore, so I knew it was time for me to go out and support the family.
How does it make you feel?
Sometimes it gets hard, like you don't think that you can go on the next day, but you have to. You just hope that you can work enough, that to bring all the money in to buy the groceries, to pay all the bills, have extra money, in case your son needs anything extra for school. I feel a whole lot better about myself. Makes me feel, hey, I'm a mom and I can support the family too, so I can do both. They're the most important thing in my life. They're the only thing that I have to live for. My husband and my son.
Wait just a second, Sharon.
Okay.
Let me give you this situation. You have no husband?
For a long time, we tried to keep it from them, that, you know, we were not, we didn't have any money. You know, we were trying to cover it up, and they were like real demanding as to, well, why can't I buy those jeans, and why can't I have those shoes, and why can't we do this, and why can't we do that? And they knew their dad was laid off, but at that age, you have no idea about money. You have no conception. And so whenever they would ask for something, I would say, oh, well, you know, maybe we can get it next month, or maybe we'll get it later, or, and then, you know, you would end up, because they would ask so many times, you say, just shut up, you're not getting it, okay? And you didn't bother to explain it, or I didn't bother to explain it. So finally I realized that, you know, we needed to sit down and have a whole family deal and talk it out and tell the kids exactly where we were at, money-wise, and what the situation was. So we did. We sat down one night and we discussed the whole thing, and everything they asked me, I tried to explain, you know, give them some kind of an answer, because there's nothing worse than thinking that, you know, you may starve to death. Now, I didn't want them to think we were going to starve to death. We weren't at that point. But, you know, like, you know, I told them our income has dropped, your dad is laid off, you know, we don't have this much money coming in. You can't have Nike shoes that, you know, that cost $80 and $90. And so we came to the point that, you know, like at their birthdays, they got, if they wanted Nike shoes, they got Nike shoes. But they still didn't get the $90 Nike shoes. They got the $50 Nike shoes. So they settled for that. You know, they were pretty understanding once we sat down and discussed exactly where everything was at. And my daughter was like, well, I don't know why you can't manage any better. So I gave her the checkbook. I told her how much money we had. I gave her the stack of bills. I said, you manage. She said, what? I said, you manage it. You know, tell me if you can figure out a way that we can manage it and still do all this stuff, I'm all for it. Let's go for it. So she started looking through it, and she looked back at me, and she, like an hour later, she handed it back to me. She said, I don't think I want to deal with this. I said, I don't think I want to either, you know, but somebody has to. And so after that point, both of them realized, you know, it was a situation that was going to be, it wasn't going to get better overnight. You know, we had denied it long enough. We had pretended it wasn't happening long enough. It's just now, this has been, I see he got laid off in 91, so this is what, 97? So it's just now, this year. Last year was better. This year, it's definitely better. For one thing, my job at the hospital does pay better. We have better insurance. I work 40 hours a week, which versus 50 and 60, that part's better. The hours I still work, or sometimes it takes up their evenings. You know, like I don't get home till after 7, sometimes after 8. It's according to which part I'm working. But the money is more steady. Like at the restaurant, you still really didn't know how much you were going to get. And here I do. I know exactly what I'm bringing home every single week. And the medical bills we don't have because we have insurance. So for them, it's better for them too, because they can look at it and say, okay, you know, mom made this much. Your time is the major sacrifice, actually. I mean, the time you give up to work and not be with your family and with your kids, and, you know, with your sisters and brothers, and be at the, you know, even the Christmas dinners. Since I've been working at the hospital, I had to work holidays too. The time that you give up away from all that, you realize is your major sacrifice, because you're giving up a part of everybody's life. Like I gave up a major part of watching my kids grow up by being at work a lot of the time. I gave up a lot of time, you know, being able to spend with my husband, like riding four-wheelers, going on picnics that they went on the weekends that I was working, cookouts. You lose a lot of friends because you don't have the time to devote to them, you know, and friendship takes being able to be there. And whenever you quit having the time to be there, you end up, you know, they become casual friends instead of your best friends. My mother is getting older, and I tried all the time to go up and have coffee with her at least 3 to 4 mornings a week. And that's my visiting time with my mother. She just lives a couple miles from me. But where I work so late in the evenings, by the time I get home and we do supper or talk or get ready, you know, it's time to go to bed. So, and I go in like at 10:30 in the mornings to work. So I usually, like whenever I took the kids to school, I would run on by my mom's house and sit with her for like 30 to 45 minutes and have coffee and catch up on what she's doing. And I missed being able to take her places and do things with her. So on my days off, I try to, you know, devote one day off to being with my mother. And, you know, she's not going to be here forever because she's getting older. Like in those 4 or 5 years that I worked a lot of hours, I missed a lot of things. You know, I missed a lot of family time. I missed a lot of time just being able to sit and watch TV with my kids. I missed a lot of being able to go where they were going and watching them practice ball or be at a ball game the whole length of the ball game. Like sometimes when I get there, they would already be out, you know, had played their turn, and their part would already be over. And I miss being able to be in all the school activities because they went on during the day. So I tried to fit all that in, you know, but there's a certain point that you just can't fit in anymore. And you have to reach that, you know, you have to realize that point whenever you get there. Because I was on like the school councils and committee meetings and at the grade school and the high school both, and working 10 hours a day. And I started school myself. Went back to college over here at Whitesburg. And you know, fitting all that in, I was like, I don't know. So finally, you know, you sacrifice your time, you sacrifice your energy, and the not being with your family and your close friends is the biggest sacrifice you make. Having been through the financial hard times, and it makes a hard time on every aspect of your life, it makes your marriage, everything, is to be realistic about it from the beginning. You know, don't pretend it's going to get better right off, because it's not. You don't get rich overnight. You don't. A lot of times you may fall back into another really good job, but the security of jobs now is not like it used to be. There's the best advice I can give, especially a younger person, is to make sure you get the education behind you so that you can go somewhere else and get a job. For people my age that are just now going through this is to try not to stress out. You know, try to keep it in a perspective that you can deal with, and don't take on so much stuff yourself. Make it be a shared thing. You know, ever who you're with at that time, make them share, your kids, your husband, whoever. Make it be a shared thing instead of one of you saying, okay, I'm going to handle this. You know, even if you're pushing it all up on the other person, then you shouldn't. You should make share the load evenly, and that way you've got somebody to talk about with it. And the main thing is just you have to work. I mean, you know, a lot of times you don't have a choice, and it's not something that you want to do, but you have to do it for a while, and you just keep it in your mind that eventually it's going to get better. It may not be tomorrow or next year even, but eventually it's going to get better. I think that's what you have to keep holding on to. Everybody says without hope there's no life, so you have to have that little hope in there saying, it's going to get better soon. You know, so that's basically it. In me, you live on if not a daily, a weekly basis. At that point, you live from week to week. You know, you pay the electric bill this week, next week. If you have to keep the telephone, you pay the phone bill. The next week, you know, you bought groceries whenever you had the money to buy them, and you learned that cooking a meal is a lot cheaper than, you know, going out to eat. It's a lot cheaper than buying all the sandwich stuff. It's a lot cheaper than buying frozen dinners that you throw in the microwave that aren't any good anyway. You learn to do without, you know, a lot of the junk food that you would normally have. I mean, we still don't buy the junk food now. As far as clothes went, they had to come down a notch or two on what they wore. And we bought things that were strictly on sale most of the time. They got, at Christmas and their birthday, they usually got whatever, you know, we could afford to buy that they wanted, that was within reason. But if she wanted Guess jeans, she usually got one pair, you know, instead of 3 pairs. Or if Josh wanted, like his big thing is Nike tennis shoes. So he would have to take the ones that were on sale versus the ones that were the most in style at that minute. Denying your kids things, I think, is probably the hardest part of your income coming down. Be it denying them the clothes they want, the shoes they want, even though it's not a necessity that they had to have. It still is hard to just look at them and say no, and especially whenever they have friends that easily get it, And it's hard to deny yourself stuff because you're working really hard, you're working all the time, and you think, well, why should I have to do without everything? I'm the one that's pulling this off. I'm the one that's working. For a long time, we tried to keep it from them that we didn't have any money. We were trying to cover it up, and they were like real demanding as to, well, why can't I buy those jeans, and why can't I have those shoes, and why can't we do this, and why can't we do that? And they knew their dad was laid off, but at that age, you have no idea about money. You have no conception. And so whenever they would ask for something, I would say, oh, well, maybe we can get it next month, or maybe we'll get it later, or and then, you would end up, because they would ask so many times, you said, just shut up, you're not getting it, okay? And you didn't bother to explain it, or I didn't bother to explain it. And my daughter was like, well, I don't know why you can't manage any better. So I gave her the checkbook. I told her how much money we had. I gave her the stack of bills. I said, you manage. She said, what? I said, you manage it. Tell me if you can figure out a way that we can manage it and still do all this stuff. I'm all for it. Let's go for it. So she started looking through it, and she looked back at me, and like an hour later, she handed it back to me. She said, I don't think I want to deal with this. I said, I don't think I want to either, but somebody has to. Your time is the major sacrifice, actually. I mean, the time you give up to work and not be with your family and with your kids and, with your sisters and brothers and be at even the Christmas dinners. Since I've been working at the hospital, I had to work holidays too. The time that you give up away from all that, you realize it's your major sacrifice. That's my biggest regret in life, is that I did not go on to college as soon as I got out of high school. I think anybody should, even if it's the local community college or if it's all the way across the country. Wherever you can go, I advise anybody to go. You may still end up working at McDonald's, but at least you have the choice. It was very hard because I was working at the Courthouse Cafe then, and I was a waitress and a cook, both part-time, did both jobs. I keep forgetting to repeat your question too. And I would work some hours. It would be some days like 10 hours a day, and we did special catering and stuff, so I worked some weekends. And I mothered my children by telephone. It was like, call me whenever you walk out the door, call me whenever you get back in the door. And it was very hard because I felt resentful that I had to be at work so much and away from home so much. And even though it wasn't my husband's fault, a lot of times I tended to blame him because it felt, I was like, if you just had a steady job, it would be, I could quit and not have to do all this. And, he often pointed out that I would work anyway, and I would, because I don't like necessarily being home full time, but I wouldn't have had to put in so many hours. And, even though I knew it wasn't his fault, it was still very hard for me to give up being home with my kids and being at all the school functions and, just being there every time they needed their mother there, because most kids want their mother instead of their dad. I mean, 99% of the kids, anywhere you talk to, whenever it comes down to who has to be there, they say, I want my mom. So, that was really hard to do that. I missed a lot of their activities, a lot of their ball games at school, a lot of their anything that happened during the day. I was very seldom able to take off or could afford to take off work to do it. We would go, like most ball games, I showed up at halftime because I worked until 7 or 8 o'clock and sometimes even 9 o'clock, so I would get the last quarter or the last inning or whatever. And, you know, but I always made the effort to make that appearance because, you know, the kids counted on me being there at some point. They knew that I was going to show up at some point. And even though my husband took them to the games and was picking them up and staying, you know, they were still waiting for me to show up because everybody else's mom was there, or because they just needed me to show up and be there. So it was hard on Hannah and Josh both to be, you know, to not have me there, to depend on me to be, you know, to drive them to, you know, they couldn't just call me at work and say, well, you had to pick us up at 5 o'clock. Because, you know, I couldn't get off at 5 o'clock. And what we would do is if they could tell us far enough in advance, the teachers or the coaches, anything they could give me like an advance warning on, then I could arrange my schedule and take that night off and work a different night so that I could be there for that. And, you know, a lot of times schools don't seem to understand that, especially, I don't know how a lot of single mothers do it, that don't have the husband or someone to do it, to help them, you know, do it, because coaches will say, oh, we're going to have practice today. Well, your child's at school, you're at work, and they're going to have practice 5 miles somewhere else after school, like 2 hours after school, so you're like, well, how do I get them there this time? So, you know, you have to have a combination, like, for I have a large family, and my husband's family lives close by. We all have just pitched in. I mean, everybody has been great on helping me handle. You know, I'm still in charge, and the responsibility sometimes got to be way too much. And the kids, a lot of times they did not understand that, you know, I couldn't show up, or Granny was going to have to do it this evening, or Aunt so-and-so was coming to get them, you know, instead of me doing it. So that was hard for them. It was real. They resented it at times, but then it made them very independent, because they had to get their own practice clothes, their own shoes, make sure their uniforms were ready. You know, a lot of stuff that other kids, their parents had laid out on the bed for them because they were home. My kids were having to come in, find it, put it in the washing machine. They both can do laundry, they both can cook, you know, they both can keep house, because, you know, on my days off, I was like, you know, I can't do all this by myself. You all come in here and help me. I would get very upset when I couldn't be there for my kids. Even if it was just like taking them to practice at Cowan School, which is a quarter of a mile up the road, I would feel, you know, the frustration is the hardest part to deal with, because there's nothing you can actually do about it. If, you know, you have a bill to pay. We had this house payment. We built this house, and he got laid off work. I think we've been in the house 2, maybe 3 years when he got laid off, and our house payments, you know, are not cheap by any means. So besides that, we would have, you know, all the other bills, plus you don't have the insurance anymore, so you have medical bills on top of everything else, and you're like, how do I pay all this? And, you know, you felt, if you can go to work because you want to go to work, it's a totally different feeling than going to work because you have to go to work. And so it's like, whenever you're forced to do something or forced to continue doing something, you get really frustrated and really upset and kind of mad at everybody. You know, you get mad at your kids, you get mad at your husband, you get mad at your family. Your best friend's life is fine, so you're kind of really mad at her too, you know, because everything's going well for them. And I have 7 sisters and 9 brothers. And at the time that my husband was laid off, there were the rest of my family, most of them were doing very well, you know. So it was really hard that way, because they really didn't understand that, you know, I couldn't drop everything and go on a weekend trip, for one thing. And we had always took big vacations. We could no longer do that. You know, it was, and they would always say, oh, we'll pay for it. And then, you know, my mom taught us growing up, you don't, you know, if you can't afford to do it, you don't do it. You know, you don't get yourself in really bad debt. Don't take things that you really can't afford to pay back. So we were always like, no, you know, we're not doing it, forget it, leave us alone. And that was real frustrating, because I would see them doing things for their kids, you know, that I would want to be doing for my children. And I would see them, you know, like at that time, a couple of my sisters did not work. So they were always there for their kids and taking them to ball practice and taking them to this and showing up at every game. And they said, well, why didn't you come? You know, and I'd be like, well, I had to work. They're like, you work way too much. And, you know, so finally I just kind of blew up at all of them, and I said, listen, you know, I have to work. I don't have a choice. I don't want to be doing this, you know, but the bottom line is I do this. And he got, after once I said that and got that out in the open with everybody I knew, you know, that meant anything to me, that I felt like they were kind of giving me a hard time about it, then I kind of got over feeling so upset. Because I knew in the long run it wasn't going to last. You know, it was going to look up. And I can look at my kids now and see that the hard times were not as bad as I thought they were at that point. They really learned a lot of really good lessons and valuable lessons that otherwise they may not have learned. And I was a lot more stricter probably than I would have been if I had been home all the time, because where they had to deal with doing a lot of stuff on their own, we had certain ways that everything had to be done. Like you had to check in, you had to check out, you know, everything had to be through me by telephone. And like if they were going with people I didn't know, then that parent had to call me, you know, before they were allowed to go, which probably put a lot of pressure on other kids, you know, because my kids they liked it. I think they still felt protective even though I wasn't there, because then I knew where they were at, I knew what they were doing, I knew what time they were going to be home, I knew who they were with, and I gave instructions, you know, to everywhere they went. And their dad took them a lot, and he would be working, like have a job that would last sometimes 3 months, sometimes 6 months, you know, and then he would be out of work again, so you couldn't let down your guard as far as relaxing. And I think that was the worst thing about him being laid off so much, was you could never relax and say, okay, this is going to work out. You know, it was just like he would have a job and it would be, okay, is this one going to last? You know, because he was laid off like 4 or 5 different times. And you would just keep saying, is this one going to last? So finally we got to the point we didn't even count on it lasting. We were just, okay, you know, this is going to get us through ever how many months he gets us through. And, you know, so we mainly depended on my income and my jobs as the security base. You know, this is the level we're at, this is the level we can deal with on a, you know, definite level. The extra money that he made was, you know, it was just extra money. It was there, it was good while it lasted. Okay. I like to work, and I guess I probably always will have a job, but it's a lot easier whenever he's working because you don't feel like you're forced to work. That makes the big difference on it. When working those long shifts, our main problem was that I would come home and nothing was done. This went on for almost a year. I think probably the closest we came to getting a divorce was over that aspect of it. And my husband was raised with, he has 3 brothers and a mom and a dad, and they never did anything at home. I mean, he'll kill me for saying this, but they literally didn't. Their dad worked all day and mowed the grass. Their mother laid his clothes on the bed for his dates, his high school, and had his toothbrush laid out on the counter. You know, that's how they were raised. And whenever I started working the double shifts, I would come home and the kids had not had supper, the laundry was still on the floor, the dishes from when, you know, everything they messed up that evening was still in the sink. The bathroom looked like I don't know what and smelled like I don't know what, you know, 9 tenths of the time. So you were like, and their bedrooms were terrible. And Danny was, he's not a real fussy about the house, you know. If it gets messy, that's fine, and you know, he's not bad. But then if it got really bad, he would say, you really need to clean the house up. So, you know, my reaction was anger, and I really bawling him out and cutting into him and saying, well, why don't you do it? You're home all day, you know, which that was a put down, you know, for him. And I didn't realize how hard a time he was having going through this of not working, you know, of being home. And part of his reaction was total depression of not doing anything. To work all day at a job, and I'm talking 10, 11 hours a day, and even at the job I'm at now, which is 8 hours a day, and then to come home and go into cleaning house, it's like a whole other job. It's like, you know, you feel like you've already worked at the restaurant. I felt like I was working 2 jobs anyway because I did double shifts. And I did, like, I would work one shift of waitressing and then one shift of being the cook. So then I would come home to another shift of doing laundry, cleaning bathrooms, you know, cleaning the kitchen, mopping the floor, having dinner, making sure there's something for breakfast the next morning. I still did all the grocery shopping. You know, I took the kids shopping for their clothes. Everything that had to be done, basically, I was the one that still did it. And it got to the point that you literally felt like you were going to have an exhaustion breakdown or a nervous breakdown because the stress of it, the stress level is really high. You realize that you're the only one that this group of people is dependent on. So it gets really, really tough to be that sole person, you know. And I don't know how people deal with it on a, you know, a long-term basis. My long-term was like 2 years, and that was long enough. I think it was kind of like I just stressed out. It was just another day of going to work and dealing with the school and dealing with everything else, and then we hit, you know, I just looked up and I saw the truck, and the sad part, or the scary part was really I saw this guy, and it was a young teenage boy. You know, and I thought, what if I killed him? You know, and that's what really, I think, shook me up more than anything, because I knew I was really tired and I was really stressed out, and I should not have been driving, because I would get in the car and my mind would go blank as far as driving went. I was thinking of all the things that had to be done and had to get done, and you know, you don't get behind the wheel and go blank. You should never do that. And I know a lot of people probably do. And whenever I hit him, it kind of jolted me, you know. I was like, they took us both to the hospital on ambulances, and I was like, you know, this working this much and the money, it's just not worth it. It's everything is a lot more important than money. And even though we weren't hurt bad, neither one of us, I think it brought me to reality on Forrest, putting into focus what my world should be about. And instead of being stressed out and overworked and dealing with trying to make house payments and car payments and everything, you know, I come out of it a couple months afterwards, you know, of really being nervous for 2 months, scared. You know, I lost weight, you know, everything. It really shook me up big time. And I come out of it with the thought that if we lose the house, big deal. There's another house, you know, and that was my main thing this whole time, was we're going to lose our house, we're going to lose our house, because I felt like we had worked so hard to be able to build our own house. And I looked at it and I said, it's just wood, you know, it's nothing. You know, as long as the kids are fine and I'm alive and my husband is alive and our world is, you know, it's halfway normal, then, you know, you shouldn't get that stressed out over money, and you shouldn't put yourself in a position that you are taking on all the responsibility instead of delegating it to everyone that's involved in that situation. It was like I was letting my husband off, letting him not have to deal with it by me dealing with it, by me saying, I'll handle this, I'll handle this. And, you know, he kind of let him off the hook to where he could take jobs that didn't last, and he could not really think about a long-term thing that was going to get us through. So at that point, that's whenever we decided that, you know, he had to find something, and the coal business was not going to be it because it was too up and down. So he had to find something that was going to make an income that, even if it wasn't as good as what we were used to, it was still going to be a steady income. And so he came up with the idea of starting his own business, and we checked into a few things, and you know, he started that and did that, and that's worked out better. And that it took a while to get us on a more even keel, and to get your nerves to settle back down, and to you know, to be able to relax enough that you can enjoy, you know, being with your kids and your husband, and not feeling like I was so used to being in control of our family and being the one that made all the decisions, that it's really still very hard for me to let him make the decisions, and it's still hard. Our income at that point was probably somewhere around $18,000 a year, which is not very much at all. Whenever you have 2 kids, a house payment, we had car payments. We had sold, you know, at one point we had a cabin in Somerset by the lake. We had a pontoon boat. We had a 4-wheeler. My husband had a good truck. I had a nice car. you know, it was the average normal life. He made around $40,000 a year, and I was working and made around, you know, $8,000, you know, because I just worked part-time. So, you know, close to $50,000 a year, that's a good income for people that are in their late 20s and early 30s. And we did great, you know, and then to go from that income down to what you feel like is a non-existent income it's a big drop. You know, $30,000 is a big drop in income from one year to the next year, which is basically what we did. We took that big a drop because he got unemployment and we got food stamps, which I hated. And the kids were on a medical card for like a year. I was trying to think what else. And those benefits do really, you know, they're good because there's a time in life that people have to have them. But to go from a bigger income to that income and to, I was used to being able to help my mother buy her medicine and give her spending money every month because she's on a fixed income. And we were used to going to the lake every weekend. We went to Myrtle Beach during the summer on vacation. The kids had been to Opryland and Kings Island and Gatlinburg. You know, we did everything every family did. And we dropped from being able to do that when my daughter was in like the 6th grade to not being able to do anything. And she was, I guess the income drop was probably even worse on them because they were used to it being available, you know, and even if they're just in the 6th grade, 12, 13, you know, I guess what, 11, 12 years old. And Joshua was in about the 2nd grade, I guess, somewhere right in there, maybe a little bit older. And this went on for 2 or 3 years, you know, so that Hannah went into her teenage years with a very low income, which was very hard because she's always been real popular, and I'm not bragging or anything, but she's, you know, she's done everything in high school and cheerleading and stuff, and being able to provide that and, you know, keep everything on a level to where they're not embarrassed. And you hate to think your kids are embarrassed because their family's poor, but, you know, in reality, I guess they are. And it can't be helped sometimes. But we went from, you know, a large income or a medium income down to a very low income. And at times we went to a month of the only income we had was my income, what I made. And that was because, like, he would have got laid off and he hadn't worked long enough at that job to draw unemployment again. So, you know, it's really tough to try to manage on, you know, just one income. Even if it's a husband's income, it's hard to manage on anybody's one income whenever you're trying to do a family and trying to have all the things that you deem necessary at that point. A lot of them you figure out you can do without a whole lot of them. Whenever I worked at the Courthouse Cafe, I worked probably on an average of about 50 to 60 hours a week. Most of the time we had catering at least one day a week, sometimes more often than that. That was extra over the other work that we did. And weekends, during the summer, we did a lot of weekend catering. So that was, you know, I would work 5 days a week in the restaurant, 10 hours a day. And then I would work weekends at different places. Sometimes it would be 4 hours, sometimes it was an all-day job. And during the Christmas season, which, you know, you need the money the most, we have Christmas parties scheduled, you know, all the time. So I would work the regular shifts and then do the Christmas parties extra, which most of those were on like weekends. And so I think the most I worked straight was 21 days straight without taking a day off. And at that, you know, you're like kind of in a no man's land then. You just kind of don't really know what you're doing and you just do it automatically and go on, and you're really grouchy. You know, those are the days I come home and went to bed. You know, I walk in the door and say, "How are you? Oh, good night." You had no recreation, nothing that relaxed you. You just went to work and you came home. You went to bed, you got up, you went to work, you came home, you went to bed, you got up, you know, and you do that. Anybody ought to try that for like a month, and you will change your mind about people who work 40 and 50 hours. Even 40 hours a week is a lot, but, you know, 50 and 60 hours a week, you definitely wouldn't encourage anyone you know to do that. Keeping your sanity is a major problem whenever you're stressed out in a financial situation or any situation actually. If it's a long-term stress, I don't think a lot of times you realize that you're that bad until someone and you know, someone will point it out and say, you know, you're really having a problem, aren't you? And mine was, I went to the doctor for a checkup because I was sick at my stomach all the time, and I couldn't eat. I dropped 15 pounds in like 2 months. It was gone, and I had never been sick. I've had one minor surgery, and you know, that wasn't nothing, and I've just never been a sick person. And since I've been an adult, I've been in the hospital twice, and that was having kids, and that was it. But whenever I went to the doctor and I had lost all the weight and everything, she looked at me and she said, you know, you're really having a problem. She said, are you dealing with this okay? I said, with what? She said, with, you know, your 40 and 50 hours of work and sometimes 60 hours of work and not being relaxed and your whole situation. Actually, she's a friend of the family. And I looked at her and I said, you know, I really don't think I am. I really think I'm having some really bad problems with this. And she made a comment that has stuck with me as far as learning to deal with things. Like, you know, people get on nerve pills, and that's one of the reasons they do. You take uppers, downers, you know, I think a lot of people turn to that because it's a way of not facing the reality of it. And she said one day, we were talking, and she said, it's just life. You just have to deal with it. You know, and that made a lot of sense because actually he is, and you just can't take it so seriously. But it's just, you know, dealing with things and dealing with long-term stress is, it's guaranteed to ruin your health. To stretch the money and to make ends meet, you live on a, if not a daily, a weekly basis. A lot of hours was where I did work as a waitress, I got tips. And the restaurant I worked in, the tips were good, you know, and especially on the evening shift and the catering jobs. So the money was saved every day. You know, we put it up, and I probably shouldn't say this, but I didn't have to pay taxes on it either, you know, because nobody knew I had it. So we had a container that every evening I come in, the money went in, you know, and so it wasn't spent except, you know, to pay the lunches and buy gas during the week. And every weekend, you know, I got a paycheck once a week. We dealt with like the electric bill, the phone bill. You learn to consolidate and to bring down, like if you had any, like we did have a savings account, and we sold the pontoon boat, and we sold, you know, the cabin, and we sold several things. Whenever we saw this was a definite, the mine was shut down, long-term layoff. So we were probably in a better position than a lot of people because we paid off most of our big bills besides like the house. And we paid off the cars. Both, I only owned on one vehicle, and we paid it off too. But within a year, everything that we had in savings was gone. I mean, totally wiped out. And at that point, you live from week to week. You know, you pay the electric bill this week, next week. If you have to keep the telephone, you pay the phone bill. The next week, you know, you bought groceries whenever you had the money to buy them, and you learned that cooking a meal is a lot cheaper than, you know, going out to eat. It's a lot cheaper than buying all the sandwich stuff. It's a lot cheaper than buying frozen dinners that you throw in the microwave that aren't any good anyway. You learn to do without, you know, a lot of the junk food that you would normally have. I mean, we still don't buy the junk food now, and we could easily afford it, but we figured out that you didn't need it anyway. You know, it just makes you fat. It's not good for you. You feel bad whenever you eat it all. So we still don't buy a lot of stuff that I used to buy all the time. But now I like to cook, and I like to make homemade desserts and cakes and cookies and all that stuff too. So that part has never been hard because it's easier to buy a bag of flour and your sugar and all that and stretch the money that way than to go buy a pre-made cake. And we did, as far as clothes went, they had to come down a notch or two on what they wore. And we bought things that were strictly on sale most of the time. They got, at Christmas and their birthday, they usually got whatever, you know, we could afford to buy that they wanted, that was within reason. But if she wanted Guess jeans, she usually got one pair, you know, instead of 3 pairs. Or if Josh wanted, like his big thing is Nike tennis shoes, you know, so he would have to take the ones that were on sale versus the ones that were the most in style at that minute. And they learned to deal with that too. And now both of them are even sales shoppers. Like when we go to the store, everybody goes to the sale rack and checks it out before we go look at anything else to see if that's what, if there's something there that you like just as much as you do the one that cost us $30 and you can get it for $12, why not take the $12 one? So, you learn to economize in that way. And we didn't travel. We, if we went on vacations, we went and visited families that lived away, and did things that were in that area, so we weren't out a hotel bill and we weren't out eating out very much, because we would cook at their house and stuff. Luckily for us, I had a sister that lived in Louisville who moved to Iowa and then now lives in Mississippi, so our vacations have consisted of going to everywhere she had moved to at that point and staying at her house. So they still got to go on a vacation every summer that way. And but the cut down in money, you just learn to economize. I mean, you don't make long distance phone calls. It sounds like, that's little bits, and it is, but those little bits all add up. By cutting down on your clothing bill, your food bill, your telephone bill, your electric bill, turning off the lights, turning off the air conditioning, don't turn the heat up so high. We bought a kerosene heater, which we had not had, and used it a lot to supplement the electric heat. I've learned, I guess the one that lost the most was my husband, because he did without more. I had to have like certain clothes that look decent to work in. If you're going to work in public, you do have to look nice. You can't go in with grubby clothes on. And he was the one that probably had to do without the most, because it was like everything for him came last. And he put the kids first and me first, and then he took whatever was left, which most of the time was not anything. And denying your kids things, I think, is probably the hardest part of your income coming down. Be it denying them the clothes they want, the shoes they want, even though it's not a necessity that they have to have. It still is hard to just look at them and say no, and especially whenever they have friends that easily get it, And it's hard to deny yourself stuff, because you're working really hard, you're working all the time, and you think, well, why should I have to do without everything? I'm the one that's pulling this off, I'm the one that's working. So it's hard to deny yourself that stuff too, and I don't know, I guess I grew up really poor. So, like I said earlier, there's 17 of us in my family, and a mom and a dad. And needless to say, we were poor. If you had 17 kids, you're poor. And we grew up working all of our lives. I started babysitting whenever I was like 12. And I stayed with older women, like while their kids went somewhere. And so I was used to working, and I was used to having to make my own money and kind of, watch out for myself. But then whenever it come to having to make money for everybody else, it got harder. And you get kind of resentful as time goes on that you're still having to work. All these years later, you're still having to work. So for a long time, we tried to keep it from them, that, we didn't have any money. We were trying to cover it up, and they were like real demanding as to, well, why can't I buy those jeans, and why can't I have those shoes, and why can't we do this, and why can't we do that? And they knew their dad was laid off, but at that age, you have no idea about money. You have no conception. And so whenever they would ask for something, I would say, oh, well, maybe we can get it next month, or maybe we'll get it later, or, and then, you would end up, because they would ask so many times, you say, just shut up.